Year-old Christopher Paul Walden was walking to school when Joubert spotted him while driving by in his car.
I walked up and just showed him my knife. I said, "Come with me, to put my hand on the shoulder." He walked over to the car.
After 11 years on death row, John Jubert's life came to a brutal end at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. At just 33 years old, the electric chair silenced him forever. But his name was already deeply etched into America's criminal history. Known as a cold and calculating predator, his merciless acts of violence against innocent children left a trail of horror. How did this seemingly ordinary young man transform into one of the most infamous killers in the country? Stick around, because what follows is a chilling story of brutality, twisted psychology, and a haunting question. Was his execution the justice it seemed, or just another violent chapter in a story that should never have been written? If you're feeling the weight of this story, don't just sit there. Hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like this deserve to be heard, and we're so close to reaching a milestone. Your subscription makes all the difference. But if you're not subscribing, please take a moment to tell us why in the comments section. Your feedback is more important than you think. And for everyone else, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to connect with you, no matter where you are in the world. In the quiet morning of September 22, 1983, 13-year-old Danny Joe Eberly set out on his usual paper route. It was a routine he'd done 1,000 times before, just another normal day in his small Nebraska neighborhood. He had his bike, a stack of newspapers, and a promise to return home soon. But this time, something would go terribly wrong. He never came back. For days, the neighborhood was on edge, searching desperately for the boy who had just vanished without a trace. His family, frantic with worry, held on to the hope that he'd simply gotten lost or was hiding somewhere. But deep down, they feared the worst. 3 days later, that fear became a horrifying reality. Danny's lifeless body was discovered in a remote, secluded area, mutilated beyond recognition, his innocence stolen by a monstrous force. But this wasn't just the story of one tragic death. No, Danny's murder was only the beginning. As the community tried to process the unthinkable loss, another child, a 12-year-old boy named Christopher Walden, disappeared in eerily similar fashion just 2 months later. The same brutal pattern, the same chilling sense of fear that gripped the once peaceful streets of Nebraska. What kind of predator would target innocent children like this? Who could move in the shadows, slipping past the safety of a trusted community to carry out such horrifying acts?
Stay with me, because we're about to dive deep into the darkness that lurked behind these seemingly ordinary streets. This is a story of unimaginable terror, a twisted mind, and a town that would never be the same again. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Let's connect. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? You won't want to miss the gripping, in-depth stories we have coming your way. In 1983, the suburban streets of Bellevue, Nebraska, were the kind of places where you could leave your front door unlocked without a second thought. It was the kind of town where children played outside until the streetlights flickered on, where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles as they picked up their mail or watered their lawns. Life was simple. Families gathered for barbecues on summer evenings, the sound of children's laughter echoed down tree-lined streets, and everyone felt safe. In a world full of unpredictability, there was a comforting sense of routine here, a feeling that nothing could ever go wrong. But that sense of peace was about to be shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable.
On the morning of September 22, 1983, 13-year-old Danny Joe Eberly was doing what he did every day,
delivering papers on his morning route. It was a typical, quiet day, just like the countless others he had experienced before. He hopped on his bike, with a stack of newspapers balanced in the front basket, and waved goodbye to his parents. There was nothing unusual about it, just another morning in the neighborhood. No one could have known that this innocent, everyday routine would be the last one Danny would ever have. But as the hours ticked by and Danny didn't return home, the worry began to set in. His parents, frantic and desperate, began asking neighbors if they'd seen him. They called his friends, checked local hangouts. There was no sign of Danny. The hours stretched on, and soon the whole town was in a state of quiet panic, unable to shake the growing fear that something had gone terribly wrong. 3 days later, that fear was confirmed. Danny's body was discovered in a remote, secluded spot outside of town. His once lively form was now lifeless, brutally mutilated, and beyond recognition. The boy who had pedaled his way down those familiar streets was now nothing more than a victim, an innocent child torn apart by a monster. The serenity of Bellevue had been destroyed in an instant. The nightmare that no one could have imagined had become a horrifying reality. How could something like this happen in such a safe, small town? And just when the town thought they couldn't endure any more fear, it happened again.
2 months later, 12-year-old Christopher Walden was abducted in the exact same way. The chilling similarities to Danny's case were impossible to ignore. The boy was taken from his paper route, just like Danny, innocent, unsuspecting, and with no warning that the predator stalking the streets had set his sights on yet another child. The neighborhood, once a place of comfort, was now a place of fear and uncertainty. Who could be trusted? Who was safe? The fear spread like wildfire. It was a sense of helplessness that gripped everyone because the truth was undeniable. There was a predator among them, lurking in the shadows. This wasn't a random act. This was a carefully planned, methodical force that seemed to strike without warning, choosing its victims with terrifying precision. The unthinkable had happened once, and now it had happened again. The peaceful streets of Nebraska were forever changed. What had once been a neighborhood of innocent laughter and carefree days was now marked by a haunting question that no one could answer. Who was behind these atrocities, and why were they targeting the most innocent among them?
John Jubert wasn't the face of a killer. In fact, he looked like the complete opposite. A 20-year-old airman stationed at Offutt Air Base in Nebraska, Joubert wore the uniform of a disciplined, obedient soldier. He was quiet, reliable, and kept to himself, always respectful in his interactions with others. On the surface, he blended seamlessly into the fabric of the small, trusting community of Bellevue. He was the kind of guy you'd see walking to the store in a crisp military uniform, or sitting alone at the local diner, just another young man doing his job. He was the type of person you'd wave to as you passed him on the street, assuming he was nothing more than a fellow neighbor, a young airman doing his part for the country. But beneath this facade of normalcy, there lurked something far more sinister. Joubert's quiet, unobtrusive nature made him the last person anyone would suspect of being capable of such brutal violence. He was the embodiment of the average, well-mannered young man, a stark contrast to the horrors he was capable of. It was the perfect cover for a predator. By day, he was the polite airman who followed orders without question. By night, he became something else entirely. A calculating, cold-blooded killer who stalked the streets, picking his victims with horrifying precision. His choice of victims was no accident. Joubert didn't just randomly choose anyone. He specifically targeted vulnerable children. Danny Joe Eberly, a 13-year-old boy simply riding his bike on a paper route. Christopher Walden, a 12-year-old boy
just going about his day like any other. These were not children who had reason to fear the world around them. They were trusting, innocent, unaware that someone so close to them, someone they would never suspect, was watching, waiting, and preparing to strike.
Joubert's approach to his murders was methodical. He didn't rush. He was patient, stalking his victims, studying their routines, learning their every move. He knew exactly when and where to strike, always when they were most vulnerable. He was a predator who understood the value of timing, the power of silence, and the advantage of blending into the background. He had no need to create chaos or make a scene. His calculated brutality was in its subtlety. He was everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, when the town realized what was happening, that these two innocent children had been taken from their lives in such a brutal, unthinkable way, it sent shockwaves of terror through the entire community. Bellevue had always been a place where children played outside, where parents left their doors unlocked at night, where people knew each other by name. But now, that comforting sense of safety was gone. The unthinkable had happened, and the killer wasn't a faceless stranger. He could be anyone. The predator could be the man next door. He could be the airman who greeted you on the sidewalk. He could be someone you never thought twice about. The fear that followed was suffocating. The realization set in, no one was safe. There were no warnings, no signs. The killer blended in so perfectly with his surroundings that he had become invisible. Every familiar face now carried the potential for hidden darkness. Joubert had created a world where trust was shattered and everyone became a suspect.
How could someone like Joubert hide such a dark side? How could a man who seemed so ordinary, so normal, be capable of such unspeakable acts? And more terrifyingly, how could he carry out these heinous crimes with such chilling precision, knowing he could return to his normal life afterward, unsuspected? His true nature concealed behind an unremarkable exterior. John Joubert's story doesn't begin with murder. It begins in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where a troubled childhood laid the foundation for the horrors he would later commit. Growing up in a home filled with emotional instability, Joubert's life was far from normal. His parents' marriage was strained, full of constant arguments and neglect. The emotional distance between them left deep scars in young John, who quickly learned the harsh reality of isolation. As a child, he was not the typical figure of innocence. He didn't feel the warmth of a supportive family. He felt abandoned, lost in his own world. The emotional turmoil of his home life pushed him further into himself, making him more withdrawn, more disconnected from those around him. While other children were learning to trust, to form friendships, and to build bonds, Joubert was learning to cope with anger and loneliness in silence. By the time he reached 13, the cracks in his psyche had begun to show. He admitted, years later, that he had dark thoughts, thoughts that terrified him. At that age, he was already struggling with violent impulses. These weren't just fleeting thoughts, they were intense, deep-rooted fantasies of power and control, of inflicting pain and dominance. But instead of finding help, or being given the intervention he so desperately needed, his struggles were ignored. No one paid attention. No one saw the warning signs that were right in front of them.
As the years went on, these violent fantasies didn't just fade away. They grew stronger, more intense. What started as thoughts became compulsions, and soon, those compulsions took over his life. He wasn't just fantasizing about violence, he was planning it. His desire for control, for the power that came with inflicting harm, consumed him. He no longer saw his violent urges as a passing phase, he saw them as a necessity, as a part of who he was. By the time he joined the Air Force, his fantasies had already become reality. He had reached a point where the anger, the frustration, the desire to dominate had spiraled beyond any kind of restraint. The dark side of Joubert, the side that had been buried deep within him,
had finally been set free. He was no longer just a boy with dark thoughts. He was a predator, hunting for his victims with chilling precision. Was John Jubert born with this darkness inside him, or was he shaped by the pain of his upbringing, the neglect, and the lack of any meaningful intervention in his troubled youth? Could his violent tendencies have been prevented if someone had recognized the signs and reached out to help him? These are the questions that haunt this case, questions that remind us how deeply the roots of violence can run, and how sometimes the signs are there, if only we know where to look.
Danny Joe Eberly was just 13 years old, a boy with a simple, happy life. He was the kind of child who loved his paper route, a task that brought him pride and purpose. Like so many others his age, he was responsible, trustworthy, and eager to take on the small but meaningful role in his family's daily routine. The morning of September 22, 1983 was like any other. Danny hopped on his bike, loaded with newspapers, and waved goodbye to his parents. There was nothing to suggest that his life, just beginning, would soon be cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. But when Danny didn't return home, the horror began to set in. At first, his parents held on to hope, thinking he'd simply gotten delayed or stopped to play with friends. But as the hours ticked by, the worry turned into something darker, something they couldn't ignore. The neighborhood, once filled with the innocent sounds of children's laughter and playful chatter, grew quiet with fear. Neighbors who had always waved hello now kept their doors locked, eyes darting to the streets where children once played freely. A sense of unease hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For 3 agonizing days, Danny's family lived in limbo, torn between hope and dread. Then, that hope was shattered. Danny's body was found in a secluded spot, his once bright spirit taken from him in an instant. But it wasn't just his death that devastated his family. It was the brutality of it. His body, mutilated beyond recognition, bore the marks of a predator's cruelty. No child should ever have to suffer in such a way, and no parent should ever have to bury their child under such violent circumstances. The grief that enveloped his family was compounded by the horror of how he had died, how someone had taken him in daylight, snuffed out his life, and left him in the cold, lonely woods, discarded like nothing more than trash.
Just as the community was struggling to cope with the unimaginable loss of Danny, the unthinkable happened again. 2 months later, 12-year-old Christopher Walden, another innocent boy, was taken in the same brutal fashion. He too was just going about his day, with no clue that his life would be ripped away in an instant. His family, like Danny's, was left in utter shock. The pain they experienced wasn't just from the loss of their child, it was from the knowing that their son, like Danny, had been chosen by a predator, had suffered in the most horrific way, and that no one was safe. The pain these families endured was not just the sorrow of losing their children, it was the overwhelming horror of what had happened to them. These murders weren't just crimes, they were tragedies that tore apart the very fabric of the families and the community. The loss was not just of young lives, but of innocence itself. In a place that was supposed to be safe, a place where children rode their bikes to school and played in their yards, that safety was shattered beyond repair. The families, forever changed by the brutal violence that took their sons, were left to grieve in ways no parent should ever have to. As their pain echoed through the quiet streets of Bellevue, Nebraska, the community was forever altered. Their trust was broken, and the sense of security that once bound them together was gone. The families of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden would never be the same, and neither would the town that had watched their lives unfold. When Danny Joe Eberly disappeared on that fateful morning, the entire town of Bellevue was thrown into a frenzy. His family, desperate for answers, immediately alerted the police. What followed was a frantic search that seemed to stretch on without end. Volunteers combed the streets, neighborhoods, and parks. Flyers were handed out. Eyes were peeled on every street corner, every alley. The community, once so peaceful, was now paralyzed by fear. The search, however, led to nothing. No leads, no answers. And the fear that gripped the town only deepened with every passing hour. Where was Danny? Had he simply gotten lost, or had something far more sinister occurred? 3 agonizing days later, the nightmare became real. Danny's body was found, abandoned in a secluded spot on the outskirts of town. His death, brutal and incomprehensible, left everyone shaken to their core. But the investigation that followed brought little relief. Every lead seemed to come up empty. There was no sign of the killer, no clues that could point to who had done such a horrific thing. The police were left with nothing but a sense of dread as the mystery surrounding Danny's death grew ever more suffocating. But just when it seemed like the case might stall indefinitely, a small but crucial breakthrough came. While investigating the crime scene, detectives noticed something peculiar. Tire tracks were found near the area where Danny's body had been discarded, but these weren't the tracks of any car known to be in the neighborhood. No one recognized them, and the vehicle that left them didn't match anything the town was familiar with. This discovery didn't lead to immediate answers, but it provided something new, a lead. And then, like a flicker of light cutting through the darkness, the tire tracks led to a 1979 Chevrolet Malibu. The investigation quickly narrowed its focus, and the spotlight fell on one man, John Jubert, a quiet, seemingly ordinary airman stationed at Offutt Air Force Base, just a few miles away. He had no criminal record, no history of violent behavior. To the outside world, he was just another disciplined, reliable young man. He had no reason to be suspected, until now. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered details of Jubert's past that painted a far darker picture. A man who had blended seamlessly into the community, Jubert's background, his criminal history, which had been initially overlooked, began to surface. His time in the military revealed troubling behavior, some of which had raised red flags that were dismissed at the time. The pieces of the puzzle started falling into place, slowly but steadily, casting Joubert in an increasingly sinister light. The quiet airman, who had been just another face in the neighborhood, was now the focus of a terrifying investigation. How had he hidden his true identity so well? How had someone with such darkness within him managed to blend into a community that never saw it coming? Joubert had moved through the streets unnoticed, hiding behind a facade of normalcy. The killer was not a faceless stranger. He was someone who had been walking among them all along. And now, the question loomed large. How could he have gotten away with it for so long? As John Jubert was led into the courtroom, the weight of the nation's gaze fell upon him. This wasn't just a local case. It was a trial that captured the attention of the entire country. The horrific nature of the crimes, the shocking revelation that the killer had been hiding in plain sight, made it impossible for anyone to look away. The people of Bellevue, once a tight-knit community, were now faced with a trial that would forever alter their lives. The families of the victims, the townspeople, and the country at large waited anxiously for justice to be served. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable in every corner. Everyone wanted to know one thing. Would John Jubert pay for his crimes, or would he be given an excuse for his monstrous actions? The prosecution wasted no time in painting a chilling picture of the man sitting at the defense table. They portrayed Joubert as a cold-blooded, calculating monster, one who had meticulously planned and executed the murders of 2 innocent boys. They laid out the facts of the case, showing how Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden had been chosen with terrifying precision, how they had been stalked, abducted, and brutally killed. The prosecution didn't just want to convict Joubert, they wanted to ensure the jury saw him for what he truly was, a predator, one whose actions were not just impulsive, but deliberate and premeditated. But the defense, of course, wasn't going to let that image stand without a fight. They argued that John Jubert wasn't entirely responsible for his actions, that his violent crimes could be attributed to a troubled psychological state. They painted him as a man with deep emotional scars, someone who had suffered greatly in his childhood and carried the weight of mental illness that had twisted his mind beyond repair. The defense's strategy was clear. They weren't denying the murders, but they hoped to convince the jury that Joubert's actions weren't entirely his fault, that his mental illness had played a major role in driving him to kill.
The courtroom drama unfolded with tension mounting with each passing day. The prosecution argued that mental illness was no excuse for the heinous crimes, that even if Joubert was troubled, he still made a conscious choice to target and kill innocent children. The defense, on the other hand, tried to humanize him, pointing to his troubled past, his mental struggles, and the lack of intervention that might have prevented his descent into violence. The question became clear. Was Joubert's mental illness a mitigating factor, something that could explain his horrific actions? Or was it merely a convenient excuse, a way to justify the pure evil that had driven him to commit such atrocities? The courtroom buzzed with emotion as each side presented its case, trying to sway the jury with facts, arguments, and a deep dive into the complexities of the human mind. The families of the victims sat in the audience, their grief hanging heavy in the air, knowing that their lives had been irrevocably changed by this trial. Every word spoken, every piece of evidence presented only added to their pain and to the growing uncertainty of whether true justice could ever be achieved. The question lingered in the air like a dark cloud. Was Joubert's mental illness a mitigating factor, something that could explain his horrific actions? Or was it merely a convenient excuse, a way to justify the pure evil that had driven him to commit such atrocities? The debate over John Joubert's fate wasn't just a legal matter, it was a moral dilemma that shook the entire community and even the nation to its core. Should this man, who had taken the lives of 2 innocent children in such brutal and premeditated ways, face the death penalty? Was it right to execute him, or was the state simply perpetuating the same violence that had ravaged his victims' lives?
The weight of this decision was immense. For some, the answer seemed clear. Joubert's crimes were so heinous, so senseless, that the only just punishment would be his death. He had taken the lives of 2 young boys, innocents with their whole futures ahead of them, leaving their families shattered, their community in pieces. For those who felt this way, the death penalty wasn't just about punishment. It was about ensuring that he could never hurt another soul, never terrorize another family. It was the end of a long nightmare. But for others, the question wasn't so simple. Was the death penalty truly justice, or was it just another form of vengeance? Could killing Joubert bring peace to the families, or would it only perpetuate the cycle of violence that had already destroyed so many lives? Was it fair to take his life, even if he had taken the lives of others? And would executing him truly offer any form of closure, or would it just deepen the grief and loss felt by those who had already suffered too much? Joubert's execution day came on July 17, 1996, a day marked by a chilling finality. He was led to the electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary, a 33-year-old man whose name would forever be associated with terror and brutality. He sat quietly, as if resigned to his fate, the coldness of the act matching the coldness of his crimes. His final words were simple, almost indifferent. "I am sorry for what I have done." But were they sincere? Or were they just the last words of a man who had learned to say what was expected of him, but who felt nothing at all? The moment the switch was thrown, Joubert's life ended. The question remained, though, was his execution truly justice? Was it the right response to a man who so callously took the lives of two young boys? Or was it just another act of violence, a way for society to match his cruelty with its own? The moral complexities of the death penalty lingered long after the execution had been carried out.
Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Was the death penalty justified in this case, or is it just another cycle of violence that we can never escape? Drop a comment below and share your perspective. Was this justice, or was it something else entirely? So, was justice truly served with John Joubert's execution? Or was it simply another act of violence, a way for society to mirror the same brutality he had inflicted on his victims? The questions raised by this case are far from simple, and the answers are even more elusive. For some, seeing Joubert die for his crimes may have felt like the only fair outcome, but for others, his execution was just another tragic chapter in a cycle of violence that leaves no true winner. The debate over the death penalty isn't just about one man's fate. It's about what we, as a society, believe justice truly is. Does executing someone bring closure, or does it perpetuate the very violence that led to their crimes in the first place? Is killing a killer really justice, or is it just a way to silence the pain without ever addressing the deeper issues that caused the crime to happen? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Was the death penalty the right form of justice in this case, or is it just another form of vengeance that keeps the cycle going? Drop a comment below and let's continue the conversation. Thank you so much for your support. We've got more gripping true crime stories on the way, so if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Until then, take care and keep questioning the truth behind the headlines.